On a January evening in 1954, at Buckingham Palace, the Queen Mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, widow of King George VI, 53 years old, sat at dinner in the private apartments she had occupied since 1936. She was wearing a fur stole, indoors, at a table set for one. Her breath was visible. The temperature in her rooms had not exceeded 52 degrees Fahrenheit in 11 days. 3 floors below, the husband of her daughter, the new queen, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, 32 years old, was in his shirt sleeves, and the central heating engineer he had quietly instructed to manage the boiler had set the controls precisely. Within 4 months, she would announce that Clarence House was, on reflection, the more suitable residence. The story the country was told was that she had chosen to move. The household knew. Philip Mountbatten, the man no one believed could beat her, had just won. The version the country received that spring was tidy. The Queen Mother had reflected on her position, weighed the needs of her daughter, the new sovereign, and decided that Clarence House, handsomely refurbished, a short walk from the palace, with its own garden, would be a more appropriate residence for a widowed consort. The newspapers reported the move as a gracious act of withdrawal. The newsreels filmed her smiling on the steps. The official line was that the dowager was making way for the young queen. The household knew a different story. Behind closed doors, the move had not been a decision. It had been the conclusion of a campaign, and the campaign had taken approximately 18 months, spanning 2 winters, 3 boiler resets, 1 bureaucratic intervention from the Lord Chamberlain's office, and the quiet patience of a 32-year-old man who had already, by that point, been told by his wife's mother that he was the wrong sort of person to share her dynasty's name. This is the story they did not tell. This is the only documented case, royal or staff, of any person on the record beating Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon at her own game. And the reason it matters is that the audience has been correcting the channel about it for a year. The comments are explicit. Prince Philip had her worked out. He stood his ground, and he won. The man no one believed could beat her had beaten her, and the channel had been telling the story the wrong way round. Tonight, we tell it the right way round. This is Prince Philip. This is the boiler engineer. This is the fur stole at the cold dinner. This is the only case. She had lived in those apartments since the abdication. When Edward VIII walked away from the throne in December 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, the Duke and Duchess of York moved from 145 Piccadilly into Buckingham Palace, and the new King George VI inherited the throne his brother had thrown away. His wife Elizabeth, then 36 years old, came with him. By the time her husband died 16 years later, she had occupied those private apartments longer than any consort in living memory. The carpets had been chosen to her taste. The painted bedroom door had been recolored to a shade she preferred. The position of the writing desk had been measured to her hand. By February 1952, when her valet found the king dead in his bed at Sandringham, she had organized the daily rhythm of Buckingham Palace around her preferences for a decade and a half. She did not intend to leave. In her view, the apartments were not her daughter's to give away. The widow of George VI had a position. The widow of George VI had a precedence. And Buckingham Palace, in her reading of the situation, was where the consort of a king who had served his country through war and through coronation and through the abdication that had made him king in the first place, Buckingham Palace was where that woman remained. The grief was real. After her husband died, she retreated to Scotland. She was persuaded by Winston Churchill, in a private conversation that has entered the diaries of the politicians who heard about it, to resume her public duties. She agreed, eventually, but she returned to her apartments at Buckingham Palace, and she made it understood that the apartments were hers. Inside the household, the message was simple. The widow had a position. The widow's position was Buckingham Palace. The household began to plan, quietly, around a queen mother who would not be moved. That summer of 1952, she visited Caithness on the north coast of Scotland, where she discovered a run-down Jacobean tower house called Barragill Castle. She is reported to have looked at it and said, "How sad it looks, just like me." She bought it on impulse for £100 and renamed it the Castle of May. It was the only home she would ever own outright. It mattered for what it told the household. Even in her grief, she was acquiring properties, not relinquishing them. The pattern of her widowhood was going to be additive, not subtractive. May was bought. Royal Lodge in Windsor was retained as her country residence. Buckingham Palace, in her reading, was retained as her London residence. Her daughter, the new queen, was welcome to share the building. She was not welcome to redistribute the apartments. Her daughter, the new queen, 25 years old and 4,000 miles away in Kenya at the moment of her father's death, came home and discovered that her own mother was now her first administrative problem. Elizabeth II needed to occupy Buckingham Palace as the reigning sovereign. The custom of the previous 5 reigns required it. The civil servants who advised the palace household required it. The Lord Chamberlain's office, then under the long shadow of the retiring 6th Earl of Clarendon, required it. And the new queen's mother had no intention of moving out of the apartments she had selected, furnished, and ruled for 16 years. Witnesses recall, and biographers have since confirmed, that the conversation between the new queen and her mother in the days after the king's death did not go well. Elizabeth II raised the question of the residential transition. The Queen Mother, who would within months be styled formally as Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, because the simple Queen Elizabeth would now belong to her daughter, declined. The new queen raised the question again. The Queen Mother declined again. What nobody mentions in the official record is that there was a precedent for what the Queen Mother could do to people who crossed her, and the precedent was on the bookshelves of every senior member of the household. 2 years earlier, in 1950, the woman who had served as governess to both princesses, Marion Crawford, known to the family as Crawfie, had published a sentimental memoir of her years at the palace called The Little Princesses. The Queen Mother had originally authorized the book. She had then withdrawn approval. Crawford was expelled from the royal circle. No member of the royal family ever spoke to her again. Her name became, inside the household, a verb. To be crawfied was to be cut off, comprehensively, permanently, and without recourse. Behind closed doors, that was the doctrine. The Queen Mother did not negotiate. She removed. And then came Philip. He arrived at the problem from a position that everyone in the household had spent 5 years underestimating. Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten of the Royal Navy had renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles, his Greek Orthodox faith, his foreign-sounding patronymic, and his independent naval career in order to marry the future queen in November 1947. He had written warmly to his new mother-in-law 2 weeks after the wedding, in a letter now reproduced in the Shawcross-edited Counting One's Blessings. He addressed her as a man who believed he was joining a family. He used the phrase, "cherish Lilibet," wondering, in print, whether the word was strong enough to express what he felt for her daughter. The Queen Mother had received the letter. She had also, according to her own court circle, never quite accepted Philip. He had no English fortune. His 4 sisters had married German noblemen whose husbands had served the Reich. He was, in her private vocabulary, a foreigner. Worse, he was the protégé of his uncle Lord Louis Mountbatten, the schemer she suspected of trying to give his family name to her grandchildren. On the day after George VI's death, on the 7th of February 1952, the question of the dynastic name arose. Philip wanted his children to be Mountbattens. The Queen Mother did not. The Cabinet did not. Queen Mary, the sovereign's grandmother, did not. Winston Churchill did not. The decision rooted up to the new queen, and on the 9th of April 1952, Elizabeth II issued a declaration that the dynasty would remain the House of Windsor. Philip's children would carry her name, not his. He took it badly. The phrase he used in private, captured by more than one biographer, was that he was nothing but a bloody amoeba. He was, he said, the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his children. The men who made that decision were the cabinet, the Prime Minister, and Queen Mary. The women who reinforced it inside the family were the sovereign herself and her mother. The Queen Mother had not invented the opposition to the Mountbatten dynasty plan. The opposition was already there, as a matter of state. But she had reinforced it. She had told her daughter in private that the dynasty her late husband had inherited and brought safely through the war was a Windsor dynasty and would remain one. Her daughter, in the first weeks of her reign, listened. The Privy Council declaration of the 9th of April 1952 made the position formal. Philip, by then, had taken the lesson. The lesson was that his mother-in-law spoke quietly into his wife's ear, and the result arrived weeks later as a constitutional document. The lesson was that she did not need to win an argument with him directly. She needed only to win her daughter. The lesson was, for a man who had grown up in the wreckage of 3 royal exiles and one mother's nervous breakdown, painfully clear. He was the husband of the Queen. He was not the maker of the dynasty's decisions. His mother-in-law was, by deferred influence, more powerful than he was. That spring, while his wife was learning the boxes of state and his mother-in-law was refusing to discuss the residential question, Philip made a decision. He would not contest the surname publicly. He would not be drawn into a row that involved Queen Mary and the Prime Minister. He would not write angry letters that would be quoted back at him in the next century. He would, instead, manage the household. The reorganization of the Buckingham Palace household after the accession is one of the underreported stories of the early Elizabethan reign. The new sovereign was 25 years old. Her husband was 31. The household around them, the comptrollers, the equerries, the dressers, the footmen, the housekeepers, the engineers, had been built around the routines of her father. Philip set about modernizing it. He wanted telephones installed to replace the footmen who carried messages between rooms. He wanted the coronation televised in defiance of the older view that the ceremony was private and sacred. He wanted Buckingham Palace to operate the way a modern naval ship operated. Clean lines of authority, no unnecessary personnel, every system on the timetable. His mother-in-law disapproved of every one of these changes. She told her circle so. The historian Jane Ridley would describe the early years of the marriage as a tug-of-war and a tussle for the ear of the Queen. The Queen Mother was on one side of that tussle. Philip was on the other. And the Queen Mother had something Philip did not. She had access to the sovereign in private, as a mother, on terms that no consort could match. But here's what the Queen Mother had failed to register. Philip controlled the engineers. Buckingham Palace in the early 1950s was a vast, drafty 20th century building with a boiler system that had been installed in stages over decades, with separate zones, separate stopcocks, and separate timetables for the principal apartments. Heat could be directed. Heat could be redirected. Heat could, with the right authorization routed through the right office, be quietly removed from a specific suite of rooms while the rest of the palace warmed normally. The engineer who managed the boiler answered to the master of the household. The master of the household answered to the Lord Chamberlain. The Lord Chamberlain, in October 1952, the 11th Earl of Scarborough, freshly appointed, answered at the very top of the line to the sovereign. And the sovereign's husband, who was beginning to take a keen interest in the engineering side of the palace, had, by the winter of 1952, learned which lever produced which result. According to the biographer Philip Eade, in his 2011 Young Prince Philip, The temperature in the Queen Mother's private apartments in the worst weeks of that first post-bereavement winter touched 52 degrees Fahrenheit. According to Tom Bower, in Rebel King, the apartments were simply unheated. According to the historian Sarah Gristwood, speaking in the Channel 5 documentary Inside Buckingham Palace, Philip had to resort to turning off the central heating in the Queen Mother's apartments. He tries to freeze her out of Buckingham Palace. After one freezing week, she moved out. Accounts diverge on the precise reading and the precise duration. They do not diverge on the substance. The boiler was managed. The apartments were cold. Plausible deniability was maintained by the simple expedient of restoring heat on alternate days, so that the household staff who came in to lay fires would not find a uniformly frozen suite to report on. Sarah Bradford, in her 1996 biography of the Queen, is ambiguous about whether the operation was Philip's alone or jointly run with the Lord Chamberlain's office. The careful reading is that the decision was Philip's. The executive routing was Scarborough's. Biographers since have not settled the point. What nobody disputes is that, by the spring of 1953, the Queen Mother had moved. The announcement came in the months before the coronation. The Lord Chamberlain's office had been working in parallel on Clarence House, the residence that had been refurbished after wartime bomb damage for Princess Elizabeth and her new husband, and that the new Queen and her family no longer needed. Clarence House had been their first marital home. They had moved in shortly before Charles was born in November 1948. They had lived there as Princess and Duke until February 1952, when the death of George VI required the sovereign to occupy Buckingham Palace. The house was, by 1953, vacant. It had a recent refurbishment. It was the obvious answer to the question of where the Queen Mother could go that would not look like exile. The cost of adapting it for the Queen Mother was £10,800. The renovations were completed in the spring of 1953. The Queen Mother and Princess Margaret moved in on or about the 18th of May, 1953, according to Hugo Vickers, the biographer whose 2005 Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, remains the most detailed personal portrait of her life. The official residence of the sovereign's mother was now Clarence House. Buckingham Palace was, at last, the property of her daughter. The Queen Mother did not, on the documentary record, embrace the move. The royal.uk page for Clarence House notes that, despite her early dislike of the house, it became the Queen Mother's much-loved home. That phrasing, early dislike, is the closest the official record comes to admitting what the household already knew. She had not chosen the move. She had agreed to the move. There is a difference. She was photographed on the steps. She smiled. She waved. The cameras did what the cameras were always going to do. The newsreel commentary spoke of a gracious transition. The papers ran respectful pieces about the Queen Mother adapting to her new role. The household knew otherwise. Years later, biographers would disagree on what the Queen Mother understood about how this had happened. Giles Brandreth, who had Philip's confidence through decades of work with him on the British Playing Fields Committee, argues in his 2004 Philip and Elizabeth that the Queen Mother understood almost immediately who had managed the boiler. Hugo Vickers, working from the Queen Mother's own papers and the recollections of her closest circle, argues she did not connect the engineering to her son-in-law until the 1960s. The dispute is genuine. The biographers have not resolved it, but both versions arrive at the same place. By the late 1950s, the Queen Mother knew. And once she knew, the relationship with Philip did not recover. Behind closed doors, the consequences played out across half a century. The Queen Mother retained Royal Lodge in Windsor as her country residence from 1952 until her death in 2002. Philip was the sovereign's husband. Royal Lodge dinners involved seating arrangements that were, on the documentary record, repeatedly adjusted to place Philip at a remove from his mother-in-law. Letters in her household correspondence from the 1990s, when she was in her 10th decade and he was in his 8th, record the unmistakable household color of a man who was no longer expected at shooting weekends where he had once been a fixture. The warmth of his 1947 letter to her had cooled. The cherished Lilibet correspondence belonged to a younger man and a younger family. What was striking, to those who saw the relationship up close, was the discipline of the cold. The Queen Mother did not denounce her son-in-law in public. She did not write a memoir. She did not give interviews. She allowed the household color to speak for her. The seating plans at Royal Lodge spoke. The guest lists for shooting parties spoke. The absences from intimate weekends spoke. By the standards of a woman who had crawfied a governess for a single book, this was restraint. By the standards of any other family, it was a sustained, multi-decade snub. Philip, characteristically, did not respond. He did not write the memoir she did not write. He did not give the interview she did not give. He attended the family functions he was required to attend. He stood the protocol distance. He had won the only round that mattered. He did not need to win another. The story she preferred to tell in those decades was that Philip was not quite up to the role he had been given. He was, in her view, dangerously progressive. He had imposed Gordonston on Charles, the school neither she nor the boy wanted, against her preference for Eton. He had pushed for television cameras at her daughter's anointing. He had replaced the footmen with telephones. He had been, she thought, the wrong sort of man for the marriage. And then, having said all of that, in 1990s correspondence and in private gatherings of her own circle, the Queen Mother lived to 101, and Philip lived to 99. He outlasted her by 19 years. She had survived Wallis. She had survived Crawford. She had survived the press she disliked and the journalists she froze out. She did not survive the husband of her daughter. He stood beside her daughter at the centenary parade in August 2000. He stood at the center of the chief mourners line at the Westminster Abbey funeral on the 9th of April 2002. He was already 80. He had 19 years still to live. Behind the scenes, the household had always known why this was the only case. Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor, was the Queen Mother's greatest hatred. She is reported to have said that the two people who caused her the most trouble in her life were Wallis Simpson and Adolf Hitler. She supported the move to deny Wallis the style of Her Royal Highness. She kept Wallis out of British court life from 1936 until Wallis's death in 1986. 50 years of a campaign so successful that the Duchess of Windsor died in Paris, a stateless social non-person. But Wallis had been outside the household. She had no access to its plumbing. She had no friend in the engineering department. She had no leverage on the boiler. Marion Crawford had been inside the household, but as a governess, a servant, a creature whose status depended entirely on the goodwill of the family she had served. The moment Crawford published a book the Queen Mother had not authorized, her access was withdrawn. There was nothing she could do about it. The Crawford case was the cleanest possible demonstration of what the Queen Mother could do to anyone who did not control any of the levers she controlled. The Mitford sisters, the social, literary chroniclers of the period, who had nicknamed her Cake, were not enemies in any conventional sense. They were the sort of clever, well-connected, marginally subversive society women that the Queen Mother could simply outlast. Nancy Mitford died in 1973. The Queen Mother outlived her by 29 years. Christopher Wilson, the royal journalist whose long career on Fleet Street produced critical accounts of the Windsors, was a problem the Queen Mother solved by ignoring him. Journalists could be ignored. A journalist could not turn off the heating. Group Captain Peter Townsend, the equerry her younger daughter wanted to marry, was handled the way the Crown handled all such inconvenient love affairs of the post-war decades. The church was deployed. The political pressure was applied. The man was posted to Brussels in the summer of 1953 as heir attaché. Princess Margaret renounced him on the 31st of October 1955. The Queen Mother had not had to lift a finger. The institution did the work. What every one of those names had in common was that they were outside the line of authority. They had no household role. They had no engineering access. They had no boiler. Philip had the boiler. He was inside the household. He was the husband of the sovereign. He had spent 5 years from 1947 through 1952 sitting in on the meetings, learning the timetables, identifying which equerry answered to which master, and watching, with the patience of a man who had been raised by his mother's nervous illness and his father's exiled, to wait for the right moment. By the winter of 1952, he had the moment. By the spring of 1953, he had the result. The Queen Mother was at Clarence House. He was at Buckingham Palace with his wife, and no one in the country had been told what had happened. That is what the audience has been writing into the comment section for a year. That is the correction the audience handed over. Prince Philip had her worked out. He stood his ground with her, and he won. The man the channel had treated, in its earlier coverage, as one of the Queen Mother's enemies, was not one of her enemies. He was the only one of her enemies she could not get rid of. He was the 7th name on the list of 6. He was the case the channel missed. And the reason the channel missed it is the same reason the country missed it for half a century. The story the country was told in 1953 was the story the Queen Mother wanted told. She had reflected. She had decided. She had chosen Clarence House. The household knew that what had actually happened was different. The household did not write biographies. The biographies that did record what had happened, Ede, Bradford, Bower, Vickers, Brandreth, were read by the readers who read royal history closely. The viewers who comment on Gilded Daughters videos are those readers. They had been waiting for the channel to catch up. Tonight, the channel catches up. The pattern of the case is worth holding clearly. The Queen Mother's enemies needed 3 conditions to be beaten. They had to be inside the household, they had to control a household system, and they had to be willing to wait. Wallis met none of those conditions. Crawford met one. Townsend met one. The Mitfords met none. Christopher Wilson met none. Philip met all 3. The 32-year-old husband of the Queen, the discredited Mountbatten, the foreigner the older household had quietly mocked, Philip, met all 3. He waited 18 months. He used a household system. He never once raised his voice in public. He left, on the documentary record, almost no trace of his hand on the levers. That is, in the end, the lesson of the case. The Queen Mother's other adversaries had tried to beat her on her own ground. Wallis had tried the press. Crawford had tried publishing. The Mitfords had tried satire. Townsend had tried sentiment. Christopher Wilson had tried journalism. Each one of them had picked a contest the Queen Mother could win, because she controlled the platform on which the contest was fought. She controlled access to the sovereign. She controlled the official biographers. She controlled the seating plans and the guest lists and the invitations that decided who counted in the country and who did not. On any battlefield she chose, she won. The only person who did not let her choose the battlefield was Philip. Philip picked the boiler. There was no charm to be applied to the boiler. There was no biography to be commissioned about the boiler. There was no seating plan that could rearrange the boiler. The boiler did what the engineer told it to do, and the engineer did what the Duke of Edinburgh told him to do. That was the case the Queen Mother could not answer. The historians who have come after have argued about whether the Queen Mother ever fully understood. They have argued about the precise temperature. They have argued about whether the order routed through the Lord Chamberlain's office on a single occasion or across the 18 months as policy. The arguments do not affect the outcome. The outcome was that, by the time her daughter was crowned in June 1953, the Queen Mother had moved out of the apartments she had occupied since the abdication. The fur stole and the cold table did not return. The 52-degree readings became a story biographers told. The boiler engineer became a household legend. She lived another 49 years. She raised her own court at Clarence House. She kept her staff of 60. She kept her overdraft at Coots. She kept her racing stable, her castle at May, her gin and Dubonnet, her painted hats, her smile for the cameras. She kept the country's affection until her death at 101. She kept everything she had ever wanted to keep, except Buckingham Palace. The one thing she had wanted to keep was the one thing she did not keep. Prince Philip lived to be 99. He outlived his mother-in-law by 19 years. In the funeral program for the Queen Mother at Westminster Abbey in April 2002, his name appeared, as protocol required, among the chief mourners. He did not speak. He did not, on the documentary record, smile. He had won the only battle that mattered in 1954, and he had spent every year since being told, by his wife's mother and by her allies, that he was the lesser man in the marriage. The audience who watched her at the cold table in 1954 knew otherwise. The country, 50 years later, finally agreed. Philip Mountbatten beat the Queen Mother because he understood the one thing none of her other enemies did. The woman ran on warmth. Take the warmth, and the woman moved.